was walking up the East Coast Sea, I saw a big city there in front of me. So many lights and shiver up my spine, that sure had a pretty skyline. Hey friend, what's that town called? New York City.
Good day, everybody. It's Gary Fielder from Denver, Colorado. I could call myself the Goose today, the goose that lays the golden egg. Every week we have one of these podcasts, and although we try to prepare our best and try to have an outline, I just kind of go in and open my mouth, and once a week a golden egg drops out. So it's also in reference to the goose being cooked. I'm also an allegory for that. We're still in the process of appealing the substantive case with regard to the dismissal of our Dominion class action case, but we're also preparing our opening brief for the sanctions element for those of you who have been following the case. As you know, the magistrate in the district court sanctioned myself and co-counsel Ernie Walker for filing a frivolous lawsuit wherein we represented voters from across the country suing these otherwise private companies, Dominion Voting Systems, Inc., Center for Tech and Civic Life, who we call CTCL, Facebook, it's now Meta Platforms, and other individuals, Mark Zuckerberg and the like, for their state action involved in the 2020 presidential election. So we're going to be going over a little bit of that, and although once the case was dismissed for lack of standing, a bunch of motions for sanctions were filed against us as the lawyers, and those were granted by the court, and that's also under appeal. Now that's sort of trailing, not really, but just because it's second in time, it feels like it's kind of trailing the substantive matter, but there still is no ruling on the original case, the standing of the plaintiffs to sue these, what we're calling state actors. And because the sanctions element of the case just sort of proceeded thereafter, it's following along. So our opening brief was due on the 18th, but we just had to request a continuance. It's just due here in a couple of days on the 1st of April, and we've been working very hard on our opening brief with regard to the sanctions issue. And it's pretty clear to me that in the end, the lawyers in this country, as other professionals in their area, have to be able to make decisions without the fear of being prosecuted. So one of the topics that we're going to go over is some of the proposed legislation that Colorado is attempting to pass with regard to the limitations of our clerks at the county level to supervise their own elections, and really criminal penalties that are being suggested for clerks that step out of line. It essentially centralizes Colorado's elections around the Secretary of State and gives the Secretary of State and the Attorney General extraordinary powers to really regulate the local counties from the types of voting equipment that they have to have instead of being able to do it the way they want to do it. And it's very dangerous legislation. It puts us in a whole different category of what we've been talking about in terms of trying to think about voting our way out of this and trying to keep a peaceful approach, because if now the voting machine companies are going to be a part of our criminal law and really just written into a part of our election law, that's all the more reason to hold the company hired to the standard of having to comply with the Constitution. That is to say, holding them to the standard of being a state actor. But I'm sensing a couple of things that we'll be talking about. First of all, the danger of having this type of legislation passed, not just putting too much power in the hands of the Secretary of State, but as an attorney, I can make reasonable assumptions. Of course, I'm not here to give anyone legal advice. I think everybody knows that. These are public videos that we make. These aren't private communications. So I'm not here to give anyone legal advice, but as a sociologist, as an amateur historian, as a trial lawyer of 30 years, I can look at a situation and sort of make reasonable assumptions. It seems to me that Dominion voting systems is helping draft this legislation. The connection between Jenna Griswold, our current Secretary of State, and Dominion voting systems cannot be denied. They're working hand in hand. It's incomprehensible for me to believe that they're not helping draft and get through this legislation so that ultimately who the vendor is, it doesn't have to be Dominion Voting Systems, Inc. It doesn't have to be them. I mean, if this really is going to be part of Colorado's law, well, then holding that vendor to the highest standard is going to be even more important, because I think we'll have to spend some more time on our next podcast on how this is going to work its way through the Colorado legislature, when it's going to be voted on, some other input that we'll likely have with regard to the need for all of you in Colorado to call your state house representative, your state senator that's in your area, and start getting into this legislation. It's called SB, Senate Bill 22-153. I'm looking at it right now. And of course, we'll be talking about that here in just a minute, but familiarize yourself with this. Reading a bill is not easy. And so if that's hard to do, then talk to a friend or read an article that summarizes the high points. Talk to your local House and Senate representative and ask them what it means, because I think it's pretty dangerous to give all of this power to just the Secretary of State when our whole system has been based upon the counties counting the votes for our elections. So we're talking about a complete revamp of how we've always done it, and really voting machines and systems just essentially controlling the whole thing. And if they're not going to be state actors and they're not going to be held to the level of the Constitution, then how are we ever going to have fair elections? How is this ever going to work? So I'm really encouraging you to get into that, and we'll be talking about that here in just a minute. So, yes, we had to ask for a short extension of time, and we're almost done with our opening brief with regard to the sanctions issue. And it really is opening my eyes with regard to the need for attorneys. The whole concept of kill the attorneys is really what a dictator would do upon taking over a country. Why? Well, it's often the attorneys that lead the way in trying to focus the population's concerns into legal reality. So if you don't have attorneys that are brave enough or free enough or stupid enough to take on these challenges, well, then you're going to have these big companies roll. And they're going to control our elections, and they're going to control who gets elected, and they're going to control them once they're in, and we're never going to be able to do anything. So, yeah, I'm feeling that throughout this process of just being attacked as a lawyer, not even as a person or as a citizen or my practice, but just as a lawyer attempting to protect the rights of others with regard to this issue concerning election integrity. So now they've taken it to the next level. Now I can see that it's a matter of becoming involved in the election, then becoming involved in the legislation, then being a part of the criminal prosecution, and you're talking to a 30-year criminal lawyer, criminal prosecution of those who don't comply and those who object. So just in my small practice over the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's been a number of different emergencies and different situations that I've had to deal with. So we just had to request this extension. But it's really going to make for a better brief, and it really was necessary. But once we get the opening brief filed with regard to the sanctions issue, we'll post that online, and I would encourage everybody to read it and get yourself familiarized further with these issues, because I'm afraid that this is not going to end well for anyone. I just really, I don't now have faith that this is going to resolve in any sort of healthy way, because as reasonable people, we always think we're going to win the argument. We always think that somehow reason will prevail. And this is such a highly sophisticated plan. It truly is the Green Bay Packers versus the Chugach Mustangs. And they're just rolling. And it is going to be very difficult for us to right the ship unless all of you get involved. And by all of you, that's a very small number of people. We all have to admit that at least 80 to 90% of the people, it's not that they don't care, it's just that they're not thinking about it. They're working, they're trying to make rent, they're thinking about raising their children, they're thinking about getting a promotion, they're thinking about going on vacation, they're thinking about their sports teams. That's all normal, that's all good, that's all anybody wants. So it's only really down to the active 10% or so that really push the buttons that get things resolved. If you're watching this video, you're likely in that 10%. Otherwise, you would have already punched stop and moved on to something else that interests you more. But in the end, if you're in that small group, well, then you're going to have to do more. You're going to have to get that state representative on your email list. You're going to have to get that state senator from whatever area you're in on your favorites. You're going to have to find their picture online. You're going to have to find their business address. Remember, all of this is in their official capacity. Don't bug people or mock people in their personal capacity. Just try to get involved in your local election so that we can start at least trying to control who's on the school boards, who's in our state houses, who our mayor is, who our sheriff is. And in that regard, hopefully that will go all the way to the top, so that when you have a national election for president and vice president, that'll be valid as well. But it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to be more than just a lawsuit. It's going to be more than just some audits. It's going to be more than political campaigns. It's going to be everything we have, because it really is everything we have. If you really think about it, at the time of the Revolution, the sovereignty devolved to the people. Now that's an incredible part of our history. Before that, nations derived their power, what we would call sovereignty, through either kings or queens or even parliaments in a shared situation, but not the people. You could look at the parliament and say, well, that's a reflection of the people, but it's still in the parliament. At the time of the Revolution, when we had no king, we had no queen, and we had severed our relationship from Parliament, the power devolved on the people. Now, we could spend a lot of time determining who the people are, and we could argue the fringes, and I've said this many times. Let's not do that. You know that if you're registered to vote, you're one of the people. Now, maybe your registration is illegal. If you're not a United States citizen, you can't register to vote. So I should say, if you're legally registered to vote, well, then you're one of the people. So you don't need to argue about it. You don't need to look at someone and say, well, you're not part of the people. As long as you're part of the people, then that's all that really matters, because it's just going to be down to those 10%. Anyways, those are the people. Those are the people that care. So, from a system wherein, for example, a king or queen had all the power to a huge group of people, whoever they were and whoever they are, had that power. And not just power on an island. The United States of America, now the most powerful country in the world. The people have that awesome power. So, we weren't used to it. Nobody really even knew it. Everybody was just so used to following the king's orders that everybody just sort of complied with what was happening at the time, which back in the day was the Declaration of Independence and the creation of state constitutions. So all of the 13 original states created their own state constitutions. Of course, we were under the Articles of Confederation for a while, and then we developed the United States Constitution, which really created our present government with the president and the balance of power and the court systems and all of that. Well, in the old days, and of course the king or the queen could appoint ministers and create courts, and they often did because they were overwhelmed, but it was still the king's power. When you went to solve a dispute and you had a problem, you went to the queen or her ministers or judges or whoever she or he, the king, appointed. The king was the fact finder and the lawgiver. So, the king would hear your story, kind of like Judge Judy, and then hear the other side's story. And then in the king's wisdom or the queen's wisdom, it wasn't both, it was typically one or the other. I'm just saying that there's really no sexism in sovereignty. If there wasn't a king, there was often a queen throughout history. And that person had all the sovereignty in terms of finding the facts, creating the law, and then imposing the law. So they really were. They were judge, that's the law, jury, that's the facts, and executioner, that's the executive branch, the jailer, the person that chops your head off. The executioner, well then that's sovereignty. That's just one element of sovereignty. Another element of sovereignty is declaring war on another country. Well, we all agreed, at least we did over 200 years ago, to leave that to the Congress created by the United States Constitution. So that's a sovereign right to declare war. Well, we gave that right over to the creation of our federal government. The states' right to pass criminal laws and thus create prisons and thus put human beings in cages, well, that's the creation of a state system whereby that portion of the sovereignty, that is to throw someone in the dungeon, was granted to the state. Now the federal prison system, they have their own system, of course, but they have to have federal jurisdiction to do that, and that's always an issue. But you can have a private prison, but that's a state function. But on your private property, even though you could maybe have a business or have your own road systems, you can't jail people. You can't create a private prison on your 1,000 acres and have like 20 inmates. That's not, all of that sovereign right was given to the state. We created a judicial system. And that way, the common law, and as it evolved into statutory law, and now into what we would have to call our American common law, we have our own common law, that gets interpreted, that gets ruled upon, that gets ordered in the judicial branch. Well, that's a part of our sovereign power that we, the people, gave over to the judicial branch, the right to determine the law. The creator of the law is the legislation, the legislator, the individual person that we send to the State House or to the United States House. They create the law. But the ability to find facts, the ability to determine who's telling the truth, that person or that person. Maybe they're telling a little bit of the truth and they're telling a little bit of the truth. That's the finding of fact. That wasn't granted to the people. No one passed a law with regard to that. That's a sovereign right. And although in the old days the king or queen decided who was telling the truth and what the facts were, and then when the king recited the facts, here's what I find. And then they would recite the facts. One side could go, oh my God, no, that's not right. You misunderstood. No. The king decides the facts. The queen, in her sovereign power, decides the facts of the case. And you just have to live with them. So once that power devolved onto the people, it was never given to the government. It was never given to the government, ever. In any of those state constitutions in their original form, in any of the state constitutions that exist now, all 50 of them, and in the United States Constitution, nor in any law other than administrative law, where the administrator gets to determine the facts. In the setting of a civil case and a criminal case, the jury gets to determine the facts. So let's take a little break and have a message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back for a closing 10 minutes. Thank you.
A message from Save Our Suffrage. As you might remember, we are a 501c4 nonprofit organization, also doing business as Dominion Class Action, which was founded by plaintiffs and supporters like you. I speak for the team when I say that we are proud to bring you the Fielder Principle podcast and to share with you a message of peace, hope, and unity for the nation. It is all of our duties to respond to these attacks on our nation by peacefully advocating through the courts and legislatures for your constitutional right to vote, to organize grassroots activism, to peacefully defend every voter's civil rights, and to further educate and empower yourselves and every citizen of this great nation with the tools of justice and peace that each of us require to save our suffrage. We are extremely grateful for the continued support from you and so many other people who believe in working towards a fair and honest society where every vote is respected and treated equally under the law. Thank you for hanging in there with us. We will keep you posted as we continue this important work to save our suffrage and the work of Dominion Class Action. To all my fellow American heroes, the age of freedom has just begun. Be at peace.
You can't sit on a jury unless you're a citizen of the United States. So that's the question. It's not a mark. It's not a racist thing. It's just, are you a citizen of the United States? So in terms of being the people, having the power to find facts, that's in the citizens of the United States. That's in the citizens of the state of Colorado. In our case, and these ramblings have a point, in our case, as I'm writing this opening brief with regard to the sanctions, I can clearly see that the magistrate, with all due respect, took that power. He took that sovereign power to find the facts, and he decided the facts. And I say the magistrate purposefully, meaning not him individually, but in his professional capacity. I still separate him from the district court of the District of Colorado because I don't think his views are reflective of the district court. I think the magistrate abused his discretion, and I say that with all due respect. It's the standard of review that must be applied in the motions for sanctions. He clearly had the sovereign authority. The magistrate is the king. He is the king. Thank you very much, Your Honor, but only to decide the law. Only to decide the law. Guess what else you get? Not as a citizen of the United States. Now, just as a person, even a corporation, even a foreign corporation, any person has a right to counsel. Now, in a criminal case, one will be appointed to you if you cannot afford an attorney. You don't have to be a United States citizen to get a public defender. If you're charged with a crime in this country, you get a public defender. In a civil case, if you're a foreign corporation and you're being sued in tax court and you owe all these taxes, well, you may not get a court-appointed attorney, but you can hire one. And then once you hire one, the attorney can come in and say, "Good morning, Your Honor. I'm here on behalf of ABC Company." So the people have a right to an attorney. And of course, the Attorney General is there in each state, and there's a United States Attorney General, but all the attorneys are private attorney generals. So in that regard, the plaintiffs in the class action had a right to go to court and ask a jury to determine these due process issues. That's what this case is all about. And they had a right to hire an attorney to help them do it. And that's what the sanctions is all about. And you can pass all the laws you want to pass. Is there anything illegal about a stepladder? No. You probably got a couple out in your garage. But go out and look at those stepladders in your garage. They have warning labels on them. Do not step. They have specific pads on the bottom that they may not have had before they were sued in a class action with regard to products liability. So now they make really nice ladders. So that's the whole point about these voting systems. If they're going to be in charge of providing due process to the people, well, then they're going to have to be held accountable to the Constitution. And if a voting systems company is going to apparently run the whole show, well, then they're going to have to comply with the Constitution and provide due process and ensure that everyone's rights to freedom of expression are guaranteed, as they are under the Constitution. So, how would you effectuate that if the actors in the state aren't going to do it? Well, you, as a voter, would go get a lawyer and come to court and establish your evidence. As most of you probably know, the Haldeman Declaration was released. It clearly establishes that Georgia's election system is vulnerable and is at great risk because of the use of these Dominion voting machines. So in that regard, it's pretty clear that the house of cards is now going to come tumbling down, at least on that particular voting systems company. And if in the end we're going to use these types of voting systems, well, then they have to be accountable to the people. And the only way, or at least one of the ways that we're going to be able to do that, is to allow the people to express themselves with their attorney in court. So keep following us and keep supporting us if you can, but don't kill the golden goose. Don't kill the golden goose. Don't go splitting the goose in half, trying to get all the eggs at once. It takes time. So thank you very much. Thank you. We'll keep fighting for you. That's for sure. Thank you.
And it's there I'll stay and shall persist till the world sees this injustice. Power to the people I will lament. The bank should not run the government. Yeah, I better be prepared to stay there for a while. This machine